Good afternoon. So good to see so many of you here for our program. Welcome to the Salinas Public Library. This is a series of programs celebrating the centennial for the library. Salinas Public Library is going to be 100 years old this September. And this is a series of programs funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. It's in collaboration with the National Steinbeck Center. So we received a 2-year grant, the first year to explore the history of Salinas, and the second year to look at the future of Salinas. So this is the second quarter program, and you've probably all seen this brochure. If you haven't, I hope you can pick one up. It's a calendar of events for January through March. It's in English on one side and Spanish on the other side. So if you pick one up and thinks it's Spanish or English, just turn it the other side and you'll be fine. But this quarter, we're looking at times of trial, 1935 to 1959. So this quarter, we're looking at World War II. We're looking at the home front, memories of World War II by Salinas residents, what was going on here during World War II. We're really privileged to have so many of you here to share your stories with us. We're going to be filming this so that we can then make DVDs and you'll be able to check it out and show it at home. And we'll also be hoping to get it on local cable television so that other people can share who weren't able to be here. But we're looking at a time when Salinas had blackouts, when there were ration books, when there were backyard victory gardens, when there were dances at the USO, and there's an armory down the street, too. We're looking at a time when Salinas had an assembly center here, when there was the incident of the Japanese internment. We're going to explore Salinas through your experiences, what you remember, what you experienced, what you want to share. And hopefully we'll get a glimpse, some of us who weren't here, who aren't from this area, or some of us who were too young or can't remember, but we're hoping to be able to stand in your shoes and gain a little bit of perspective and understanding about that era. Because that's really what this program's about, is to understanding the history of Salinas through the people of Salinas. We have some official partners for this program, and I want to introduce them. If I see, let's see, the Salinas Women's Club. Salinas Women's Club was responsible for the library being established in Salinas, and I don't see anyone here from there. Okay, the Valley Guild, is Susan here? The Valley Guild, who operates the Steinbeck House, they were also instrumental. We've got some friends from the Valley Guild. The Friends of the Salinas Public Library are an official partner. Intervisión, which is the Spanish language media, local media, is a partner, and the Monterey County Historical Society. And they've provided many of the images that you see on this brochure, the photographs and the postcards. So again, this is our centennial year. Our next quarter is going to be 1960 to 1985, and that's The City Emerges. And look forward to those programs in April, May, and June. They're going to cover the United Farm Workers, the urbanization of Salinas, the rejuvenation of downtown Salinas. So we're covering the entire history up until 2000 this year. So please pick up these calendars as you see them, and come to all of our programs. I think you'll enjoy them. Again, so pleased to have all of you here. I hope this is not the first time you've been in the library, and certainly not the last time you'll be in the library, because we want you all here. So I'm going to introduce, let's see, is Garland up next? Garland, thank you. Garland Thompson is one of our program officers, and he's also our techie, and he does the filming. So Garland, you're up next.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome to the Salinas Public Library and our program today. Allow me to set the scene for you, and then I will turn it over to Lori Wood and our wonderful panelists. In the year leading up to the dramatic attack on Pearl Harbor, on that fateful day, December 7th, 1941, while America had begun fortifying itself against the threat of the war in Europe, and Americans watched war dispatches from distant shores, most Americans still did not feel that the war concerned them personally. In Salinas, life continued as usual. In February of 1941, a crowd of 2,000 people went to the Southern Pacific Station right down here on Market Street to bid goodbye to the 107 young men of the Salinas Tank Corps as they left Salinas. It was a happy occasion. These were young men, many just out of high school, who had joined Salinas' National Guard unit, converted just 4 months earlier into an Army tank battalion, with the understanding that they would be gone for just a year and that they would not serve in war. They proceeded through their training and were stationed in the Philippines, told that they would be in service only until the regular army had built up its armored forces. On December 1st, 1941, the same day that the USO building here in Salinas was completed, the first of its kind, I might add, in the entire nation, the Salinas Tank Corps was deployed around Clark Field in the Philippines. No one knew at that moment that Clark Field, along with Pearl Harbor, was about to be struck in surprise attacks by Japanese bombers as the U.S. was drawn into World War II. No one could have known that these 107 young Salinas men would later be caught in the Bataan Death March, and that only 47 would return to Salinas. Like much of America, Salinas residents were shocked that America had been attacked, and life in Salinas was instantly changed by the United States' entry into World War II.
Thank you, Garland, and thanks everyone for being here. So it's December 7th, 1941 in Salinas. John Struve, the Struve family had co-owned Struve and LaPorte funeral homes since 1927. John Struve was in Salinas Junior College, Junior College, when the war began. He later enlisted and became a bomber pilot in the Battle of the Bulge. Olive Bungard came to Salinas in 1935 from Nebraska as part of the Great Migration and graduated from high school in Salinas in 1943. After some years away, she returned here 10 years ago. She was a junior in high school the day the war started. Pat Garlinger was raised in the Alisal and was about 19 the day the war started. She threw her considerable energies into efforts to aid the war effort, spending much of her time dancing and helping out at the Salinas USO. She worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture also when they experimented with growing guayule in Salinas. Roy Diaz grew up during the Depression on his family ranch outside Salinas. So he would have been about 24 years old the day in February 1941 when he boarded the train with 106 other young men from Salinas who had joined the 194th Tank Battalion, Company C, we call the Salinas Tank Corps. That would have made him about 28 at the end of the war when he was released from the prisoner of war camps in the Philippines, having survived the Bataan Death March, one of 47 survivors of the 106 members of the Salinas unit. Roy Diaz doesn't remember anything that happened in Salinas during that time because he was not here. He left Salinas and he returned to Salinas in peacetime. But the ordeal that Mr. Diaz and other Salinas sons suffered and the uncertainty about their fates and their families in Salinas gripped Salinas during the war years and was an important part of Salinas' experience during the war. And we're honored to have him here with us today. Lorraine Diaz was only 7 when the war broke out. She was Roy Diaz's neighbor. And during the days of rationing and shortages, she would go over and sit with Roy's mother as she awaited news of her son. After the war, Lorraine and Roy Diaz were married. Dorothy here was born and has lived her whole life in Salinas. As a piano teacher for many years, she taught many of the children of Salinas over the years. She also played for the choir at Sacred Heart Church in Salinas. She was about 27 when World War II began. Lorraine Lowe's parents came to Salinas from San Francisco when she was 4. Her father owned the Social Market and in Salinas during the rationing period. She worked at Salinas and Alice House schools for years, and she's active in the Chinese Seniors Club and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And she was about 14 when the war started. Agnes Thibault came to Salinas about 1936 from Texas, and she arrived at the brand new railway station on Market Street. Mrs. Thibault married and made her home in Salinas, where she worked for the Tynan family for 47 years. And Agnes Thibault was 27 years old on the day in Sunday when the war started. So we will start the story here. And I'm going to ask John Struve to begin, because he was at Salinas Junior College the day after Pearl Harbor. Why don't you talk about Pearl Harbor and start us there, sir? You can just sit down.
Okay, how's that sound? Actually, the day the war started, it was typical that I was not at home. I was up in the Upper Carmel Valley with some friends hunting wild pigeons. I happened to have a car that had a radio on it. So when we came back to our car to go home, there were about 20 guys standing around my car looking in the windows trying to get into the car, and I come up and said, "What's wrong?" "Well, is this your car?" "Yes." "Well, we understand the Japanese have attacked at Pearl Harbor and we're trying to turn a radio on. We don't have radios in our cars," which was true in those days. If you had a radio in your car, you were very fortunate. So we turned it on and listened and heard the announcer screaming and yelling about what had happened. And boy, in about 5 minutes, there wasn't a guy left. Everybody jumped in their cars and took off. To hell with the pigeon hunting and everything else. They all left and went home. And the first thing I did was drive out to the Salinas Air Base to see what had happened. And the gates were all locked out there, and guys were standing with rifles at attention. So we knew we were in serious trouble. So one more thing that was quite impressive. I was a student at Salinas Junior College, and on Monday, everything started on Sunday. You know, that was the famous point. The reason the reason the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on Sunday, I am told, because most of the sailors in the Navy had all been in town having a big time that night and were still in their bunks and their ships and things when the attack came. A lot of them never got out of their ships, but they had it figured everybody would be asleep over there, and that was pretty well true. They were not prepared for the attack. So the next day we went over to junior college, and the place was a complete bedlam. Guys running in every direction. The president of the college had already been called up. He was a colonel. Richard Warner, he was the president of Hartnell. He left a few days later, and guys were running everywhere with papers in their hands. I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I've just bought out of the school. I've resigned from the school. I'm going down and enlist now." There are dozens of guys running every direction. Going to join the Navy, going to join the Army, going to go here, go there. They're all retiring from school. By the time the day had ended, there was nothing but girls in the school and just a scattering of young boys like myself. And so I was able to stay there with these friends until, how long you want me to go? They wouldn't draft you until you were 18.5, I think it was. And I was 17, so by the time we got around the next year, I was 18 then. And then we started getting a little bit nervous because the war was still going real big. So I talked to a man and he says, "Well, you guys are going to be 18. Very shortly, you're going to go right away. You've got low numbers. You're going to be cinched to go." So there was 6 of us in town here. They were all going to junior college, and we got together and said, "We got to do something." And we all concluded that we wanted to do something really important, and we all wanted to be officers among anything else. They didn't want to be in the rear ranks with a rifle. So we went out to the air base here, and all 6 of us joined. We took an examination to join the Air Corps training cadet program. We all passed it, and the fellows that were in it with me were a fellow named Don Barsati, who still lives here. There was an Ellis Langley, Hunter Johnson. I'm going to forget somebody. Come on, Ruth. doesn't matter. Oh, Mike Hughes. And unfortunately, he's the only one of the 6 that is deceased. He was killed in a helicopter accident. Maybe some of you remember that some years ago. But the rest of them, as far as I know, are still alive, and they're all about 74, 75 years old. Anyway, we joined the Air Force, went through flight training and all that sort of stuff, and about a year and a half later, we were commissioned and were sent immediately to England to participate in bombing raids over Germany. Want me to stop?
Now I'm going to pass this to Agnes Thibault, because she was in Salinas. Yeah, she was in Salinas at her restaurant. She was in Salinas at her restaurant. Yeah. She was at Salinas at her restaurant the day the war started. And she brought this newspaper that she has, the Honolulu Star Bulletin. And she made some comments to me about how it felt to find out there was a war. I'm going to hold this up. Tell us about hearing about there was a war. Hold this up.
We had a little restaurant on Market Street. And somebody came and said, we're at war. I said, what?
Really close to your mouth, Debbie. All the way like that. There you go.
But we're a long way from it. It's in Hawaii. I'm not good at this.
You're good. Just I'm going to hold this for you. I'll hold it for you. Ready?
Good job.
Just doing good.
You're doing fine. They're anxious to hear you.
They're anxious to
Put
hear
both
you.
hands on
Let
it.
us know.
Tell your story.
Come back.
Dad, you hold it up for
Here,
us.
back.
Yeah, that for you. Just look at that. Just don't look at it.
I gotta think about that. Ask me a question.
Here's the question.
All right, you were in your restaurant.
Yeah, we had this little restaurant. It was on Sunday. On a Sunday. And they said Pearl Harbor had been bombed. I said, where's Pearl Harbor? Anyway, so we were at war, and I said, well, as long as they're not here. I don't know what I said too much, really. I should have been
Business go on. Did business go on?
Oh yeah, business went on as usual, but everybody was frightened, and everybody was, and at night it was time to go home. We could hardly find our way home. We had to feel our way home. No street lights, no car lights. Imagine trying to drive in the dark to get home. But then as time went on, we really became frightened. I know I was.
Where was the restaurant?
By the underpass, on Market and Monterey, across from that grocery store there.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Across from, no, there's the underpass, and there's that,
Right.
yeah, there's a restaurant on that corner. I think there's still one there, and there's a grocery store there, and then there's the Steinbeck parking garage,
Yes.
and then the park. So we were on that
Yeah.
fourth one.
And Mrs.
But-
Thibault, how did you hear that the war had started?
But somebody came in the restaurant, and they said they had bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, I didn't know anything about Pearl Harbor then. I don't think too many of us knew too much about it. They bombed Pearl Harbor, and I said, oh well, they're not over here. Anyway, but that's how we found out about it, and of course the paper. We read about it in the paper the next day, but I paid too much attention to it because I just couldn't believe that this was happening. Really, I couldn't believe it.
So what happened as the weeks went on and you started to understand that we really were at war? How did that feel in Salinas?
Awful. It was awful. We were frightened. We thought we're coming over here and we're going to take this country. A whole lot of things came to mind that didn't happen, thank God.
What about getting your supplies? Did you right away were told you couldn't have butter or you couldn't have?
Oh, everything just about, we couldn't have almost nothing. I mean, not right away, but we couldn't get things. Everything was frozen, sort of. Not everything, but a lot of stuff was frozen. But then it really was scary. I really was frightened. It was scary because I thought they'd come over here. Oh my God. Even though I said, well, they're far away over there, but they could come here too.
Did the restaurant stay open all during the war?
I never did want the restaurant in the first place. So when the wars came along, I told my husband we're closing this place. Yeah, we're closing it. So we really didn't stay any long. I didn't want it. He's the one who wanted it.
So more stories of that first day. Olive Bungard told me some stories of what that was like. Mrs. Bungard, tell us how.
I don't really remember the first day except it was Sunday, and I think we listened to the radio all day. But I do remember that we were sent home from school because the Japanese were in a submarine off the coast, and they were landing off of Monterey Bay somewhere. They were coming. I think it was almost right away that we thought they were coming. Well, I was sent home, and I don't remember doing much. I don't think I hid under the bed, but anyway, there we were, and nothing happened, but we were sent home from school. And I think several times we got under the desks, but other than that, we weren't frightened too much that they were apt to be here any minute. That's all I really remember about that.
Who else has a story of the first day of the war, though, when you first found out? Mrs. Garlinger.
Yeah.
I was sitting on the back porch steps with my mother. My dad opened the door and said, "The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." And we said, "Where in the world's Pearl Harbor?" And everything went on. I had a date that night to go to Fox Theater. We went to Fox Theater. All the windows were covered with blankets, and we had to cover all our windows in the house with blankets, and you had to drive around with dim lights. And I was in Salinas Junior College the same day John was, and we sat there in the old gym, and the president announced that we were at war, and we just sat there, you know. We couldn't comprehend it. The next few days later on, when the Japanese students started disappearing, we didn't know what happened to them. And it slowly started sinking in over the days, finally. And even when I graduated in 42 from junior college, it still was a war, but it hadn't really sunk in too far. It was just later on when we started the rationing of shoes, sugar, all that.
So, Mr. Diaz, I'd like to ask you. Mr. Diaz enlisted in February. Well, he left Salinas in 1941. But, Mr. Diaz, if you would, could you tell us what it was like that day with the men from the Salinas Tank Corps when you got on the train and what you expected when you went out? I want to set the scene for that. And hold the microphone very close to your mouth.
Well, we got on that, before we got on that train, it was pouring rain. We marched right down to the depot. And we all jumped into the train. A lot of people saying goodbye. So the train took off and headed for Fort Lewis, Washington. We got there around the middle of February. In March, I was over in Fort Knox, Kentucky, learning how to put a tank together. After driving horses and a team in a farm, they put me out there working on the tank. So I passed the tank examination. I was one of the head ones there to take care of those tanks. Because when we got overseas, the malaria hit us. My sergeant, he couldn't do nothing. I was all by myself working on tanks. So, but leaving, we didn't know there was going to be a war. I remember when they said there's no troops are going to go overseas or anything, and and we was below, didn't have enough men in the tank company, so they heard that message, and boy, that thing filled up in a hurry. So that's like how a lot of Salinas, most of them, all Salinas people, and that's not 106 and 115. And what?
And sir, keep holding your microphone closer to your mouth because they can't hear you in the back.
Well, it's just something about getting in a train. There's, getting on a train, go to destination is Fort Lewis, Washington. And when I came back from Fort Knox, Kentucky, I went back to Fort Lewis. And here are the details, putting big boxes together and packing this and packing that. And I said, well, what's all this going on? Oh, we're ready to move. I said, where are we going? We're going to Fort McDowell, San Francisco. Oh, yeah. I said, now you know what Fort McDowell is. That's an embarkation for overseas. And that's who we ended up right there, overseas.
So then you got on the ship, and it took you 3 months, did you say? 90 days to get to the Philippines?
Oh, that's when I was a prisoner.
But you ended up in the Philippines.
In the Philippines, yeah. It was headed for Japan. And we left Manila Bay in the night. And when I woke up in the morning, I told Amy Morello, I said, we're right back to where we started. So we stayed there 2 weeks. We blew the boilers out. It was an old ship. So it's finally we made Taiwan. From there, we took on a load of rock salt. Then we were sitting pretty low in the water, you know. So that's when they sank all those ships up there. And honest to God, I don't know how they missed us. Because we looked around and I said, hey, we're all alone here. And that's the way we got to Japan. Most of the time the boilers blow out, we'd pull in at a place and fix it a week or two, and then they go again. That's why it took us 92 days.
So then you ended up in Clark Field, and the reason we're talking about this now is what we didn't know in Salinas. No one knew what was coming. Something like 9 hours after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Clark Field in the Philippines was bombed. And this is where our Salinas guys were. They were all okay during the initial bombing, but can you tell us a little bit of what it was like with all those guys from Salinas in the Philippines?
Right next to Clark Field at Fort Stotzenberg. And that day the bombing was, before that, this is Captain Moffat of C Company, and Captain Muir, I think it was, from A Company. They came battling down there with their Jeep down to the headquarters, and they said, get all that aviation gas we used on the tanks. Hide them under the trees, do something with them. Because he says the Japanese are on their way. Now here's 2 company commanders, knew the Japs were on the way. I don't know what those other high officials were doing. So, the day they came over, it was 12 o'clock. Oh, and about a half an hour before that, we had all our planes buzzing around because we was they were flying around, and we was on a half track patrolling the Clark Field. Anyway, 11:30 they came down, every one of them. 12 o'clock we looked up in the air and they said, oh, look at the Navy planes. I said, Navy, your foot. Those are Japanese planes. And boy, we found out. They started to drop the bombs on us. And then came in the pursuit planes, strafing. everything was mixed up over there. They didn't know what they were doing. So that was the end of it there.
So this was the experience of our team in the Philippines at the time. Now remember, this is the first day of the war in Salinas. So everyone in Salinas is shocked. Everyone in the Philippines is shocked. The whole thing is beginning. Did you have something you wanted to say about that first day in Salinas? 'Cause I would like to talk some more.
I was surprised he didn't bring up the death march.
We'll be talking about that, but what we're going to do is go in order here. Okay, we're still talking about the very beginning. And one of the things I want to ask you now is, so we're still December 8th, 1941. Very soon after that, the day after this happened, Japanese citizens in Salinas, their bank accounts were frozen. And then first generation Japanese disappeared because the FBI took them away. All Japanese citizens started being under curfew, and I think it was Mrs. Garlinger mentioned that her Japanese friends disappeared and no one really understood where they had gone. It happened very quickly, and I'd like to ask, from your perspective, what was that like to see that happening? What did you think, and we look back on that time now, what did you think was happening, and what did you think about it for those who were here in Salinas? I think, was it, who is it that, yeah, you weren't here. Who?
Well, we were just very curious as to what happened. And I was, at that age, when you're 18, 19, you're so busy thinking about yourself, going to school and all your friends and everything. And I didn't ever question it. The only thing we questioned was the fact that maybe we better watch them because maybe they've got friends and they'll bring them over here and they'll conquer us. So that was the way we were thinking. We were a little afraid, but not, we just couldn't understand why this had all happened. And so we were just, I guess really at that age, we weren't that curious what happened to them. Later I've heard, what did happen. Maybe she's got more to say.
No, I just wanted to add a little bit to you, because one of my very good friends in high school, we used to do 2 piano things together when we were in high school. And so we were always good friends. And then she became one of the secretaries. She worked in the high school office. Her name was Gladys Onoya. You remember Gladys. And so she was gone. And that's what made me think about it, because I thought, what happened? What's going to happen to Gladys? And the Onoya family, we had so many good Japanese in my class, I know, and in school. So many good Japanese families. And I never tracked her down. I don't know to this day what happened to her. But she and I, for some reason, we had a very fine music teacher at Salinas High. And he was very supportive of the music department. And he had Gladys and I start the 2 piano thing. And we just had so much fun. And at that time, the high school audience, when you're put in the study hall and you have to sit there, and these young people are not so crazy about, but they they would never listen to what we played now. You can imagine, they would hoot us off the stage. But I mean, in those days, it was a thing. We didn't have any television or anything like that, so. But it was very anxious days, and I've often wondered about Gladys.
Does anyone remember, a lot of people lined up outside the Armory in April. Does anyone remember that?
Yes, I remember that. Just a misty rain. The Armory was so full of people, they couldn't all get in there. And I walked by there, and these people out there and I said, they're going to get wet. They're going to get wet out there. And nobody seemed to do anything about it. It was really sad, I thought. I thought it was the saddest thing that could happen here.
Agnes, what were they doing? What was they at the Armory for?
They were at the Armory waiting to be taken away in the camps. The Japanese citizens of
Oh, you mean the Japanese
United
were?
States? Yeah, the Japanese, these were American citizens.
Yeah.
They were waiting to be taken to where they took them.
Yeah, but we didn't know for sure what
Nobody knew.
Nobody knew.
Scared. I was still about it. That's warm.
She said she was bothered about it. It bothered her. And if you look up here, you can see that's the executive order that started the mechanism to intern the Japanese. And we'll be talking about this again in real depth at 3 o'clock. But for people in Salinas, the Japanese neighbors disappeared.
I was in high school in King City, whenever the war broke out, and the teachers called us all into the big auditorium and explained to us. So we were all crying, and the fellows were really sad. I mean, we were just so upset. So it wasn't a happy time.
And Lorraine Lowe also has a story about
Well, first of all, they were Japanese Americans, and I had a few Japanese friends, and when they had to go to gather at the rodeo grounds, I know that when they graduated from junior high school, there was a separate ceremony for them. I remember that the principal of Washington Junior High School, which is Washington Middle School, her name was Myrtle Harbinson. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I see some nods. And she went down to perform the graduating ceremony for them. But I know that my dad owned the Southall Market, and meat was very scarce to get. And I remember him on the phone at approximately 4 a.m. calling his connections, and he managed to get a lot of meat to bring to the store and have his workers cut them up and have them ready for a sale. And I remember that butter was was rationed, and one of my favorite customers was Mr. R.D. Case, who was the superintendent of schools, she remembers. And I was really happy to get him the butter, but he could only get 1 cube because that was all his stamps allowed him to get, unfortunately. But there were only margarines that people could buy that had little packets of red coloring in it. Oh, I see everyone remembers. And you had to mix it up, and you had to pretend it was butter.
Didn't have enough bracelets for shoes, and I used to look at all these beautiful shoes, you know, and I thought, gee, I don't have enough rations, you know, and it was just, is it too high? No. Anyway, I couldn't get any shoes, and it was terrible. And you couldn't buy anything, and bubble gum, I was just a young kid, and to bubble gum, I couldn't even buy that. But it was a bad time, and we lived on the ranch, and we'd have to cover the windows up with black sheets or something so that the light wouldn't shine. And but it was a bad time, and but we were lucky we lived on the ranch, that we had chickens and poultry and our own vegetables, but still it was awful, you know. It was just a very bad time, and I feel sorry for everybody at that time. And,
well, my father owned the grocery store and the meat department, so we really didn't suffer that much, but we always had stuff to eat. But I don't remember a vegetable garden. Maybe that's why I don't like gardening right now. But I do remember a lot of my friends being herded out to the rodeo grounds, and it was so awful. And even then, I think it was kind of like a troublemaker, because I thought it was really unjust and couldn't understand the reasoning of it, because all of these people were American citizens, and not just first generation, but second and third generation Japanese Americans. So it was hard for me to understand. And when they came back to the high school after the war was over, it was a little strange at first, but
afterwards, I just think that everyone sort of wanted to forget and really hope that things would get better. And I know that some of my friends are going to be speaking in the next section about their experiences, and they have, in fact, you might know about Saks Fabric Store and a few other places that these were people who came back from the internment camps. And I had gone to a visit to Death Valley. We visited Manzanar. That was one of the places where the Japanese Americans were stationed. And the teacher who led our group, his mother-in-law was there. Mount Whitney is the background of the camp. And all the years that she was interned there, she never even noticed the mountains. That was how terrible it was for her. So it was very traumatic for everyone.
And John Struve's father took care of the Japanese cemetery. Is that right?
Yes, I wanted to say one thing first, though. The Japanese were not the only ones that were bothered by the government. German aliens and Italian aliens were also rounded up. They didn't put them in a camp like they did the Japanese, but they identified them and found out what they were doing and kept an eye on them so they couldn't cause any trouble if they did. Now, out on South Main Street, there's a place called Yamato Cemetery. It's an ancient Japanese cemetery. It's been there for years. And my father, having been in the funeral business, was a friend of the Japanese and always took care of them when they died. So one day the police department came down to our office, which incidentally is right across the street, and said, "You're in charge of the cemetery," apparently, with all the people said. "We've got to get what do I want to say? They're destroying the cemetery, knocking the stones over, breaking down everything, just desecrating the place." So my dad went down there and looked at it, and I don't know, he got some money together somehow, and they built a fence all the way around the cemetery with a big gate and everything, and locks. And then they had the police watching it so often, enough that they didn't bother it anymore. So after the war, when the Japanese came back here and got settled again, they honored my father with a dinner for having saved their cemetery during the war. It wasn't desecrated like a lot of places were. So we were very proud of my father for what he did there.
Thank you. So now we're in April 1942, and by the end of April, early May 1942, all the Japanese Americans had already gone through the Salinas Assembly Center and were there in tents in the mud, and no one heard from them much anymore until they were finally sent away in July. So meanwhile, in April in 1942, in the Philippines, the American forces surrendered. So we had 115 Salinas boys there, a small community of Salinas in the Philippines. And I want to pass this to Mr. Diaz. And I just want to preface this by saying we don't have the time that it deserves to take to spend to talk about what our neighbors went through. And we're so happy to have him here. And I realize as I'm speaking to everyone that we must continue this and have deeper conversations about this. But he will give us a small mention of what he and so many of the Salinas sons went through in the Philippines after the surrender. Now hold your microphone right to your mouth. Real close now.
The Bataan March. Well, we was away in the China Seas. It couldn't go no further. In Mount Marvelis, that's where the march started. Up the hill, into the thing, and then we kept it going, nothing to eat. You get a drink of water, you better go run fast to the artesian well. If you did, you get shot. So then at night they let us rest. Next morning we get up again, same thing again. But there was guys, remember one time on the march. Phew. This other soldier passed by me there, and I said, "Where are you going in such a hurry?" "Well, you better get up there in the front of the line. Don't stay in the back because you'll never see daylight again." I said, "What's the matter?" If anybody falls down, they chop the head off or shoot them. I followed this guy to the front of the line. And we didn't eat for 10 days, I guess. And then finally we hit a little town, and they gave us a bowl of rice. And that was it. Next morning we went to town San Fernando. There's where they had that narrow gauge box cars. And they just shoved us, loaded us in there. We're going to a prison camp. Loaded us in there, just push, and they hardly could close the goddamn door. And when we got to our destination, I got out, and 3 guys dropped dead. They were dead, standing up. So we hit O'Donnell was a camp. That was a mess. The water shortage, everything. Finally, the 3rd day I was there, they asked for mechanics. And the mechanics were there, and they wanted us to go for work on machinery. So we all volunteered. We was going to stay there at O'Donnell when you see 400 or 500 people going to the graveyard. So we got down there. Where did we go? But we rode this time back to Bataan. We went, repaired all the trucks, most of the trucks, and they had another detail from there to send it to Manila. And then they ship it for scrap iron to Japan. So I was down there in April. I didn't get out of there till July. Sick with malaria. They come back, and this other prison camp, Cabana One, and I was so sick I fell out of the truck, bounced like a chicken with its head cut off, and they put me on the hospital side. So the hospital side and the other side were both the same thing. There was no medicine. You just sweat it out. And that every day, though, we was in the sick side, you see the Americans 50, 60 going to the graveyard. And I was going to say something, I forgot.
Sir, were you with a lot of the Salinas group? Were you together there a lot in the camp?
What?
Were you with other men from Salinas in the camp, or had you gotten all mixed up?
No, we was all, we wasn't together no more. They put us in prison camp, and then these guys went in detail, and another detail, and we just didn't, like Frank Uther, I didn't see him till the last time I seen him was 1942 when we surrendered. Until when he got back home, he came up to the ranch and he says, "Let's go deer hunting." There's a month of November, and I just got home from the Philippines, just about a week. Okay, I decided let's go deer hunting. We went to Nevada. Hey, was it cold. Whew.
So let's just set the scene now. So here, from the time that they disappeared, all these families in Salinas, maybe almost 100 families, had their sons, their brothers, they just disappeared. These people were in camps for, 3 years almost, and many of these families had no idea whether their sons and husbands and brothers were alive or not. And I think that as I'm learning about the history of Salinas, I have to stand in the shoes of those people to see what it was like. And it cast a pall over Salinas. Ruth Andreessen tells me the stories she's heard about women in the coffee shop sitting there asking, just sitting there wondering whether their loved ones were still alive. So this is an important part of how it felt to be in Salinas during World War II. So I want to ask, for those of you who were here, in the mystery of who was gone, what was it like? I mean, of the women here who remember.
Well, life went on, as I say.
And what did you know, and what did you wonder?
Well, I was so busy in school.
I was busy in school, and life went on. My father worked for the post office, so he went to work every day, came home every day. So that was a normal thing, and the only thing, he had to ride his bicycle into town because there was gasoline rationing. But later in that year, in '42, I got married, so I moved. I lived in East Salinas for 5 years until after the war was over. But life went on, except for rationing and everything. The only thing that I, as a young person, remember was when we'd read the newspaper and say, "Oh dear, so-and-so had been reported killed over in Baton or wherever it was."
So you did hear little by little of occasionally people.
Yes, but it was a great day when they got home, those who made it, because a lot of the boys that were over there I'd gone to school with. So there were tears and sadness about it. But it was, in my world, it was a busy world. You were busy working and trying to keep ahead of everything and listening to the news and weeping over the people that died.
And Olive Bungard told me a story of what it was like. Remember you said that everybody had someone.
Everybody had someone in the war, that's right. But I don't really remember because I was in school. I was in high school and then I was in college. And in the summertime I worked. I worked usually on one side. I fed the troops that came. I can't remember the lady I worked with. We had a coffee shop. And every time the troop trains came through, we gave them coffee and cookies. I don't know where it all came from, but I remember putting it together.
So let's talk about that. So now life during the war.
That was during the war.
There was the USO, rationing,
And
blackouts.
dancing, yeah.
Let's hear about that.
That's what I forgot to tell you. My experiences was when I graduated from junior college, I went to work for the Jewish lady that worked at the USO building right over here, and I was their office girl, and the soldiers would come in and I'd write letters home for them to their mothers and report on them that way, say, well, I met your son and so and he's doing fine. And then also my father was very involved with the USO, and so he asked my sister and I to go come in and go dancing with the boys. And
so explain how that worked. How did that work? Tell us what the USO was and what was it all about?
The USO is the USO right over there, just exactly the same. And we'd go in and they have a dance band and all these handsome, good-looking young uniformed men were there, and of course we were all gaga over them. And then of course the boys had come in at the airport. There was a troop of boys that came into the airport, and they came in, different units, would come in and dance certain nights. And they'd come, then we'd go over to Fort Ord and dance, we'd go down to King City and dance at the Air Force down there. And gosh, I met the handsomest cavalry man. Oh, gosh, he was dashing.
And I understand you were always chaperoned home, right? The dancing draftees.
We had more fun, and we got to dance with and I danced with some fellows from South Dakota, I remember, and he took me out on a date, and I went to a Chinese dinner over in Watsonville, I remember. Gee, to go to Watsonville, that was a trip. Gosh. And he was a real good-looking guy, and so I'd never kiss a boy on the first date. That was not allowed. And so he grabbed me and kissed me goodnight, and I thought, whoa. And I kept in touch with him for a long time. He went over and he was in the war, and he lost an arm in New Guinea. That was the sad part about that. Oh, he was a nice-looking fella. And I don't know whatever happened to him. Somebody else took his place. But we did. The girls, lots of the ladies around Salinas danced, and they have their husbands. My sister married her husband. He was from Massachusetts, and a lot of my girlfriends married boys that had come to be in the Air Force out there at the airport. And I can't remember, a lot of the fellows that came over at Fort Ord were shipped out quite a bit, so they didn't stay, too long. A few of them, I guess, met them and married them. But it was a happy time for us. I mean, we had a good time.
Mrs. Diaz, do you want to talk about what it was like during the rationing? You mentioned shoes were in shortage. What else was it you couldn't get?
Well, I just wanted to tell everybody that when Roy got back, all the guys, they formed a place out at the airport, and it was like a Quonset hut, wasn't it? Yeah, and it's called they named it the 40-47 Club because of the 40 guys and the 47. And they'd meet there all the time. They had the best time. They danced, and Edna and Frank and the Brokaws, they all got together, and it was really something. It was nice, It just.
It must have been a relief after the war was over.
Was when it was over. And
who else wants to say something about life during the war? Anyone have a victory garden? What was a victory garden like, Mrs. Bungard? Use the microphone. Let's hear about your victory garden.
I tried to remember what she could only grow. I want to say Kyle or something like that.
Chard.
It looked like lettuce.
I think you said it was chard. Okay, yeah.
And chard, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's all she was able to grow, but she gave it to the mailman, and he went with it in his basket, I think, every day. So, poor thing, I think he was glad when it was over. But a lot of my friends, their fathers would dig up the whole yard and potatoes and all kinds of things in there. So everybody had to have a vegetable garden.
And why was that?
Well, we had to eat that ourselves because we couldn't buy it. Right. Well, maybe we could give it to our friends. But I didn't eat all that she was able to grow.
And how did rationing work? I've seen the Monterey County Historical Society has an old rationing book from Salinas with these little blue tickets. So explain to me, how does a rationing book work?
I had to take my rationing tickets to college with me, so my family was sorry to see me go. And my father never did have a new pair of shoes, I know that. He gave his shoes to somebody, my sister or myself, I think. And there never was enough of anything, I don't think.
I think I remember something. I went to Washington Union School up in Crowley Terra, and I couldn't get shoes, so I wore these old boys' shoes, and they were all kind of scuppered, and they had holes in them. And we used to have cardboard inside the holes because we couldn't get no shoes. And if it would rain, these soggy old shoes would get all...
Hold your microphone right here. Hold your microphone up here. Okay.
But anyway, that was the times. It was the hard times, but it's something that you live and you can remember all these things but they don't have. I don't know. I just learned a lot.
And I remember a story. Go ahead.
But the shoes didn't have shoes because of the. But it was hard times. But we survived, and. I don't know.
Mr. Struve has a story about rationing that I remember, about his gas stamps. Would you like to tell us about how you could get gas tickets? Tell everyone now.
My father, being in the funeral business, was given unlimited gas stamps. Blacks, some kind of stamp anyway. It gave you unlimited gas to do what you want to do. So we didn't miss out on any hunting or fishing or anything, because Papa had plenty of gas stamps. But he lent me, Lonely Sound mailed them to me, and I used them on occasions to bribe the sergeant in the office there. I was stationed at Stockton at the time. I was going to get my wings and graduate, and my mother and dad wanted to come up and see me, but I wasn't going to be there. I was going to be sent to Marfa, Texas. So a friend told me, get some stamps, give them to the sergeant, and you'll go to Stockton instead. And that's what happened to me. Now, I graduated from Stockton, and the other 300 guys were madder than hell at me because they knew I'd pull a deal. And they all went to Marfa, Texas, and I graduated to Stockton and came home and had to. Well, one thing I want to say, and then I'll get out of here. All the Japanese did not go to the internment camps that we had here. I had a friend, Tetsuo Okada, and several others that came by to see me one night, and they were leaving for Chicago. Apparently aliens who lived in the Midwest were not bothered. They were allowed to continue their life there. But on the coast, either Atlantic or Pacific coast, they had to be back, I don't know how many 100 miles. So this fellow went all the way to Chicago and came back after the war, and he died a few years ago in Monterey. But there were any number of them, Germans, not Danes, God's sake, Germans and Italians. The Danes are on the other side. And they all moved out here, a lot of them did. If they were aliens, if they were localized, then they'd stay. But if they were aliens, they got their tail out of here. So that's that for now.
Now, Ms. Here, what do you remember about